Okay, hopefully by now you have some idea of what modal realism is all about and why Lewis proposed it. Today we're going to look at some of the objections. Well, first and most obviously, modal realism commits us to a fairly wild ontology. Every possible world really exists. There's an infinite number of universes, some of them almost duplicates of ours, some of them completely unlike ours, and they all really exist. There are possible worlds exactly like our world, except an electron in the Andromeda galaxy is in a slightly different place. Think about the number of electrons in the Andromeda galaxy. Every one of those electrons could have been in a slightly different place. There are real worlds corresponding to every one of those possibilities. That's a lot of Andromeda galaxies. And right now we're only considering a slight change in the location of an electron. So that doesn't scratch the surface of all the possibilities there are. So this is basically what Lewis called the incredulous stare. Modal realism is just crazy. Now, I'm not actually sure that the stares these days are quite so incredulous. Many worlds theories in quantum physics have softened us to the notion that reality might contain far more things than we intuitively expect. Of course, many worlds theory is very different from modal realism, as we saw in the first video, but it also expands our ontology very radically, so maybe it's made us a bit more accustomed to these huge multiverses and so on. Now, an incredulous stare isn't an argument, and I think that the philosophical point underlying the incredulous stare is that modal realism offends against Occam's razor. Modal realism is highly unparsimonious. Occam's razor basically says, don't multiply entities beyond necessity. It's a methodological rule of thumb that says you shouldn't postulate entities unless you have a good reason to do so. If two theories of the world are otherwise equal, we should prefer the theory that postulates the fewer entities. We should prefer the theory that is ontologically simpler, more parsimonious. And broadly speaking, that's surely the right approach. What Occam's razor says is, you shouldn't postulate entities if you've got no good reason to. If there's some phenomena that we're trying to explain, and you can explain it perfectly well by appealing to entities that we already believe in, well, don't postulate new ones. So we have this desire to keep our ontology lean, and that's surely a good rule of thumb in methodology, and modal realism strongly offends against that. But of course, if we put it this way, Lewis has a fairly obvious response. Lewis would say, well, look, we have very good reasons to be modal realists. Modal realism is the best theory. So modal realism doesn't multiply entities beyond necessity. Modal realism is superior to other theories of modality for the reasons that we examined in the last video, and so we actually have good reasons to believe in all of these entities. Also, Lewis would say. The point is that makes it kind of difficult to evaluate appeals to Occam's razor, right? Because obviously Lewis's argument rests on the claim that modal realism is much better than any other option. Lewis also argues that modal realism isn't as unparsimonious as it initially seems. He draws a distinction between quantitative parsimony and qualitative parsimony. So quantitative parsimony is simply a matter of how many things there are. Qualitative parsimony is a matter of how many types of things there are. So imagine one universe containing 50 electrons, another universe contains 1 electron and 1 photon. The universe with the electron and the photon is more quantitatively parsimonious because it contains fewer entities, but it's less qualitatively parsimonious because electrons and photons are different types of entity. One isn't reducible to the other, so there are more types of things there. So I hope that distinction is clear. Now, according to Lewis, qualitative parsimony is very important when we're judging the relative merits and costs of theories, but there's no reason whatsoever to care about quantitative parsimony. It really doesn't matter whether we say there are 3 electrons in the universe, or 10 to the power of 80 electrons in the universe, or an infinite number of electrons. Suppose some new result in physics tells us that the universe is bigger than we thought, so contains more things. Well, that's interesting, but nothing special. On the other hand, if an experiment suggests that there's a completely new kind of fundamental particle, that's pretty amazing. That's the kind of thing that can lead to scientific revolutions. It's only when a theory adds entities of new types that we should be concerned about parsimony. We should only apply Occam's razor to types of entities, not just the sheer number of entities. So with this argument in mind, Lewis says that modal realism only affects quantitative parsimony. We already believe in a possible world. We believe in the actual world, and the actual world is one possible world. All modal realism does is add more entities of that type. It just adds more worlds like this one. So it doesn't postulate completely new kinds of stuff. So it's not qualitatively unparsimonious. It's not unparsimonious in the way that matters. So Lewis suggests. Now, I think this argument is pretty silly. I think we could, first of all, question Lewis's claim that quantitative parsimony is of no worth whatsoever. But the main problem here is that, as Joseph Millier points out, Lewis worlds aren't worlds like this one, right? Many of these worlds will have totally different physical laws. They will contain totally different kinds of things. There will be worlds with ghosts and gods and demons. There'll be worlds with completely alien properties that we can't even conceive of. So that's clearly a violation of qualitative parsimony as well. Whatever you think about the worth of quantitative parsimony, modal realism, it violates qualitative parsimony more than any other theory that we have on the table. I mean, Lewis says that every kind of thing there could possibly be, kinds of that thing, things of that kind really exist. You don't get more unparsimonious than that. So I find that Lewis's argument here, it's kind of like somebody who believes in God, responding to an atheist. Imagine someone who believes in God responding to an atheist by saying, well, it's not unparsimonious to say that God exists, because God is just a thing. And you already believe in lots of things, like tables and chairs and flowers and mountains. They're all things, and God is just one more thing. So Occam's razor doesn't work against God. Whether or not you believe in God, and whether or not you think Occam's razor should apply to God, that would be a very silly thing to say. So I think that modal realism is pretty clearly unparsimonious in terms of its ontology, although it may be worth noting that another distinction relating to parsimony is the distinction between ontological parsimony and theoretical parsimony. Ontological parsimony is what we've been talking about. It concerns the number of entities there are in the world. Theoretical parsimony isn't about the simplicity of the world, but the simplicity of the theory. So we might sum it up as don't multiply assumptions or hypotheses beyond necessity. Arguably, a theory such as modal fictionalism is less theoretically simple than modal realism, because the fictionalist talks about possible worlds in the same way the modal realist does. Right? The fictionalist will say basically the same things about them and will use them for the same purposes. But then the fictionalist will have to add some story about how possible worlds discourse is a fiction, and that requires specifying how we're supposed to interpret it and how it connects to modal facts. As we saw, one of the benefits of modal realism is that it allows us to take our discourse at face value. So the modal realist might try to reduce the worry about parsimony by showing that as a theory, modal realism is simpler. Although whether that really has any sort of worth in terms of whether we should believe it, is obviously open to debate. Okay. Second objection is that modal realism simply fails to capture modality. Modal realism is irrelevant to modality. This objection was first raised by Saul Kripke, I believe. Recall how Lewis explains the modal properties of individuals. This is counterpart theory, right? So according to counterpart theory, to say that Hitler could have won World War II is to say that some counterpart of Hitler in another world did win World War II, or a counterpart of Hitler won a counterpart of World War II, I should say more technically. To say that Hitler is necessarily human is to say that every counterpart of Hitler is human. Now the objection here is that when I say Hitler could have won World War II, I'm talking about Hitler himself. I'm not talking about some counterpart of Hitler or some set of counterparts of Hitler. Hitler could have won World War II means that this particular guy could have won World War II, not that a bunch of people who happen to be similar to him could have won World War II. Another way to make the same point is to note that we care about the modal facts about ourselves. So I could become a philosophy professor. I certainly hope I do. So the fact that I could become a philosophy professor means quite a lot to me. It's important to me. Now, on Lewis's analysis, I could become a philosophy professor means that I have some counterpart in another world who is a philosophy professor. But I couldn't care less what somebody in some other world who happens to be like me is doing. That doesn't matter to me at all. So Lewis's theory, so this objection goes, doesn't really tell us anything about modality. John Divers formalises the argument essentially along these lines. We are concerned with premise 1, we are concerned with modal facts about ourselves. Premise 2, we are not concerned with facts about counterparts. That should just be facts about counterparts. Obviously, they're not technically modal facts, they're just facts about counterparts. Conclusion, modal facts are not facts about counterparts. So this argument is suggestive, but it is invalid. Suppose you're very interested in Captain Beefheart. He's one of your favourite musicians. One day a friend of yours says, you know, Don Van Vliet lives just down the road from you. Isn't that amazing? And you don't think much of this, you've never heard of Don Van Vliet. So you might be tempted to reason like this. You might be tempted to say, well, I'm concerned with facts about Captain Beefheart. I'm not concerned with facts about Don Van Vliet. So facts about Captain Beefheart are not facts about Don Van Vliet. But Captain Beefheart is Don Van Vliet. They're the same person. The point, of course, is that you're not aware that Captain Beefheart is Don Van Vliet. The argument doesn't work because you don't have perfect knowledge. So similarly then, it could easily be that modal facts are facts about counterparts, but because we're not aware of this, we can be concerned with modal facts, but not concerned with facts about counterparts. So the argument is as I say, invalid. But I do think that it still hints at a genuine worry, which is that on Lewis's analysis, it turns out that, you know, it seems like modal statements about individuals aren't really about those individuals at all, and that just seems weird. When we talk about Hitler, how Hitler could have won World War II, we're not really talking about Hitler, we're talking about people in some other world. It's just a very strange conclusion. And I think what Lewis would say to this is that this objection is just wrong. It just gets it wrong. On modal realism, it is a fact about Hitler that he could have won World War II. When we say Hitler could have won World War II, we are referring to Hitler himself, and we are describing a fact about him. Now, what makes this fact true is that a counterpart of Hitler in another possible world did win World War II. So we need to distinguish between the meaning and reference of our statements on the one hand and the truth conditions of our statements on the other. Hitler could have won World War II is a statement about Hitler, refers to Hitler. But what makes it true is a fact about Hitler's counterparts. I guess it's like if I were to say Hitler is widely criticised or Hitler is despised by everybody or whatever. Those are statements about Hitler. I'm referring to Hitler. But what makes those statements true are facts about other people, facts about other people's feelings, how other people feel about Hitler. So maybe that would allow the modal realist to get out of this problem. Certainly, the modal realist wants to. What the modal realist wants to say is that the statement Hitler could have won World War II is about Hitler. There is a modal fact there. It's possible for Hitler to win World War II. But what makes that the case, what makes that true, is that his counterparts in some other world won World War II. So maybe that works. The third objection is the epistemological problem. If modal facts are made true by possible worlds, and possible worlds are totally isolated from us, so we can never interact with them, how can we ever know anything about modality? How can we ever acquire any knowledge of it? How we can acquire knowledge is in general a big philosophical question, of course, but one very intuitive idea is that knowledge of things requires interacting with them in some sort of way. Certainly all our everyday knowledge and all our scientific knowledge rests on having some kind of connection with the entities that we claim to know about. So this implies a causal condition on knowledge. We might say that a person P can have knowledge of facts X only if there is a causal connection between P and X. Now there might be some exceptions to this. Our universe is expanding, and due to that expansion, there are places so distant from us that light is unable to reach us, in principle. We know that there are galaxies beyond the observable universe that, in principle, we can have no causal connection with. Nevertheless, we might say that we do know about these galaxies, we know they exist, we have some idea of the elements that must comprise them, we have some idea of what they probably look like. They'll presumably be spirals or ellipticals or whatever. So, in fact, we don't need a causal connection to certain objects to know about them. Of course, this point is rather questionable because when we say we know facts about galaxies beyond the observable universe, we're just extrapolating from galaxies that we've already studied, galaxies that we do have access to. There isn't, it's not like a new class of entity or anything like that. We're just assuming that the rest of the universe is relevantly like the part that we can see and that we have studied. We have a causal connection to lots of other galaxies, and that's what allows us to make reasonable assumptions about those galaxies that we can't see. So I think with appropriate qualifications, something like the causal principle does seem to be a fairly intuitive idea. We learn about the world by interacting with it, and we will generally withhold a belief in an entity until we can detect it. So currently there seems to be very good reason to think that there's a ninth planet in the solar system. I assume you've all heard of this. The evidence is really striking. Some people have suggested what this planet might be like, what kind of atmosphere it might have, and it does look likely that it exists. But until we can detect it, it's just a prediction. We shouldn't believe in it. And actually, even if you do currently believe that there's a ninth planet, well, that will be because of the causal influence it's had on entities that we can detect, because of the way its gravity has affected other objects in the solar system. So even with that, there's a causal connection, it's just less direct. So anyway, all of this is a big problem for Lewis because there's no causal interaction between different worlds. So how can we know about them? Well, basically Lewis just denies this causal condition on knowledge. According to Lewis, knowledge of X doesn't necessarily require any causal connection between the knower and X. Here, Lewis draws an analogy to mathematical entities. Lewis is a Platonist. He thinks that numbers really exist as mind-independent abstract objects. We mentioned Platonism in the last video. The Platonist in mathematics has the same epistemological problem as the modal realist, because you can't interact with abstract objects. So the question arises, if Platonism is true, how can we have any knowledge of mathematical entities? Now Lewis, unfortunately, doesn't really answer this question. He just says, well, we do have knowledge of mathematics, and mathematical entities have no causal connections to us, so knowledge of particular facts doesn't require those facts to have causal connections to us. Not really a very satisfying argument, mainly because I'm not so inclined to accept Platonism about mathematics. But if you are a Platonist about mathematics, then I guess fair enough, you might just deny that knowledge requires causal acquaintance. But there's still a question here, because obviously much of our knowledge does require causal acquaintance, so we need to explain, why does this sort of causal condition seem so intuitive? Now, Lewis suggests that the kind of knowledge that requires causal acquaintance is contingent knowledge. So contingent knowledge requires causal acquaintance, necessary knowledge doesn't. Mathematical facts are necessary facts. It's a necessary fact that 2 plus 2 equals 4. It's a necessary fact that in Euclidean space the angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. Similarly, modal facts are necessary facts. It's contingently false that dragons exist. Okay, dragons don't exist. They don't exist in our world at any rate. There are no dragons. But that's a contingent fact. They could have existed. So it's contingently false that dragons exist. But it's necessarily true that dragons could exist. It's necessarily true that it's possible for dragons to exist in the broadest sense of possibility. We have contingent knowledge that there are no dragons at this world, but we have necessary knowledge that dragons exist at some possible world. The reason why the distinction between contingent and necessary facts makes a difference is that nothing can depend counterfactually on necessary facts. So consider visual perception. My visual experiences give me knowledge of the world. They give me knowledge of the contingent facts of the world. Right now I'm looking at a computer screen. I know that there's a computer screen in front of me. That's a contingent fact. The computer screen might not have been there. And if it hadn't been there, then my visual experience and the beliefs that I formed as a result of that experience would have been different. If the state of the world had been different, then my visual experience would have been different. If the computer screen hadn't been there, then I would instead have had a visual experience of a wall rather than that of a computer screen, because there's a wall behind my computer. So, similarly, if there'd been no water in the cup, I wouldn't have felt the fluid sensations when I brought the cup to my lips. If there had been no electrons in the cloud chamber, you wouldn't have seen those white streaks in the cloud chamber, etc. Okay, so we have there's this counterfactual feature of our contingent knowledge, but nothing can depend counterfactually on necessary facts. It's not sensible to say if 2 plus 2 hadn't been equal to 4, then I would have experienced such and such, or if the angles of a triangle in Euclidean space hadn't been equal to 180 degrees, then I would have seen so and so. Those just wouldn't be sensible things to say. So the crucial point for Lewis is that knowledge of contingent facts has these patterns of counterfactual dependence, whereas knowledge of necessary facts doesn't. And that's why knowledge of contingent facts, but not knowledge of necessary facts, requires causal acquaintance. With contingent facts, it makes sense to ask how things would be different if those facts didn't hold. So Lewis says that the point here is there's a distinction between the contingent facts and the necessary facts, and causal acquaintance is required for contingent facts, but modal knowledge, knowledge of modal facts, that's not contingent. Modal facts are not contingent facts. Notice that this, of course, accounts for why the causal conditional knowledge seems so compelling. Pretty much all of our everyday knowledge and all of our scientific knowledge is contingent, so it requires causal interaction. But mathematical knowledge isn't contingent, and neither is modal knowledge. Dragons don't exist, we need to interact with the world to know that, but we don't need to interact with anything to know that, in the broadest sense of possibility, it's possible for dragons to exist. Or in other words, in some possible world, dragons exist. Of course, that still, all of this still leaves open the question of, well, okay, so how do we come upon modal knowledge? How do we have knowledge of modal facts? What are the processes involved by which we come to have knowledge of them? And Lewis does say a little bit here. So, according to Lewis, standard modal knowledge, the kind of everyday stuff, rests on appeal to a kind of principle of recombination. Broadly speaking, anything can coexist with anything else. So we can look at the world and imagine adding things or removing things or mixing things up in different combinations. I see a rat, so I know there could be 2 rats. There could be an infinite number of rats. I see a dinosaur skeleton, so I know there could be rats and dinosaurs coexisting at the same time. I know there could be an infinite number of rats and dinosaurs coexisting at the same time. I have a glass in front of me. The glass hasn't shattered, but I know that other glasses do shatter, and I know that this glass is relevantly like them in terms of its molecular structure, so I know this glass could shatter. Hitler didn't win World War II, but other people did win World War II, and I can imagine Hitler occupying the role of the winner of World War II. Furthermore, I'm able to make logical inferences. I can see that certain propositions are contradictory, and that tells me what can't exist. It's all fairly obvious stuff. Lewis basically explains modal knowledge in, I guess, the same way we would. Just appealing to the same sorts of reasoning that anybody else would appeal to. So he adds, of course, that what that knowledge what that knowledge amounts to is knowledge of other possible worlds. But in terms of the processes involved, It's just sort of standard, usual ways that anybody would say. I mean, it's also worth noting, incidentally, regarding this epistemological problem, that Lewis might be able to turn this problem around and sort of apply it to other people. I mean, how do other views account for our knowledge of morality, of modality, rather? Linguistic Ersatzism says that possible worlds are sets of maximal consistent propositions, but we don't see maximal consistent sets of propositions just hanging in the air, right? We don't seem to have any kind of causal interaction with such sets. So maybe one strategy for Lewis would be to accept that there's an epistemological problem with modal realism, but then say that other theories of possible worlds have the same problem. So it's not really just modal realism. It's not a problem for modal realism. It's a problem for everybody. And to be fair, I mean, modal epistemology in general is difficult. I mean, we don't really have clear ideas of how it works, and that's one reason why the sort of skepticism along the lines of Quine that I mentioned in the last video might seem appealing. Okay. Fourth, we might object that modal realism fails to capture all the possibilities. So modal realism is simply inadequate as an account of modality. I'll note three ways in which Lewis's theory might be deficient. First of all, as we saw in the first video, Lewis defines worlds in spatio-temporal terms. A world is a maximal spatio-temporally connected object. What distinguishes one world from another is that they are spatio-temporally isolated. But couldn't there be worlds that have no spatio-temporal relations? Worlds that are structured in radically different ways? It's certainly difficult to imagine what such worlds would be like, but remember that modal realism is supposed to cover all of the logical possibilities. Is there any reason to suppose that a world without spatio-temporal structure is logically impossible? I'm not sure that there is. This problem is especially pressing because it's actually not clear what counts as a spatio-temporal relation. So a world with exactly the same physics as ours would obviously have spatio-temporal relations, but what about a world that's structured on Newtonian physics, or a world that's structured according to Aristotelian physics? Presumably those would be spatio-temporal as well. They're different kinds of spatio-temporal relations, but they would still be very different kinds of relations to our world. So how different can it get? I mean, what counts as a spatial relation? What counts as a temporal relation? Lewis doesn't say much about this, and so that makes it kind of difficult to evaluate what sorts of worlds there are supposed to be. A second concern raised by the spatio-temporal definition of worlds is that it seems possible for there to be island universes. It seems possible for there to be two or more completely disconnected spacetimes. Okay, universes that are just not connected anyway, island universes. But this possibility is ruled out on Lewis's theory. There is no world containing two or more completely disconnected spacetimes, because if two spacetimes are completely disconnected, they are by definition different worlds. So in fact, island universes are impossible, according to Lewis. This is especially odd because you could have a world in which two spacetimes are completely disconnected for, say, 1 billion years, and then they become connected. And you can have a world that starts out as one spacetime, but which becomes two disconnected spacetimes for whatever reason. So it seems kind of arbitrary to say that it's not possible to have two spacetimes that never have been and never will be connected. So that might be a problem. Now, Lewis's response to this problem is simply to say, well, okay, intuitively island universes are possible, but we should just reject that intuition. It's not an intuition that's central to our thinking about modality or to the world in general. So we should just accept it and deny that island universes are possible. Just say that they're actually not possible. But I think there's actually a deeper worry here, which is that arguably Lewis's theory is simply inconsistent on this point. Because on the one hand, Lewis has to assert that it's impossible that there be two or more completely disconnected spacetimes, because there is no world at which there are completely disconnected spacetimes. On the other hand, Lewis asserts that there are many worlds, and he distinguishes worlds by saying that they are spatio-temporally disconnected. So there are many, indeed there are an infinity of completely disconnected spacetimes. I hope this problem is clear, right? What makes two things different worlds is that they are spatio-temporally disconnected. And Lewis asserts that there are many worlds. There are many completely disconnected space-times. But Lewis has to say that it's impossible for there to be completely disconnected space-times because, by definition, no world contains disconnected space-times. And something is only possible if it occurs at some world. So there's a big worry here about whether this is even consistent. So it's one thing to say that island universes aren't possible, that completely disconnected spacetimes aren't possible, but dealing with this inconsistency is quite another, if indeed it is inconsistent. So that I think is the bigger worry here. A third way in which modal realism perhaps fails to capture all possibilities is that it seems possible that there be nothing at all. There could have been nothing. But there can be no world at which there is nothing. Even if we sort of expand the definition of world so as to allow worlds that aren't built from spatio-temporal relations, no world is nothing. A world is something. Even a very empty world is still something because it's still a world. On this point, again, Lewis bites the bullet. He accepts that it's a necessary fact that something exists. Total nothingness is not possible. So that might be another worry there. Okay, finally, an interesting objection to modal realism is that modal realism leads to a sort of moral paralysis. Suppose I see a drowning child. Of course, my immediate reaction is that I need to go and save him. Now, I can do a small thing here to prevent a great tragedy, but suppose I'm a modal realist. Well, if I save the child, this only means that in countless other worlds, my counterparts will let the child drown. My choosing to save the child literally guarantees that in some other world, one of my counterparts will let him drown. Although we can affect the amount of good and evil in the actual world, we have absolutely no control over the total amount of good and evil over all the worlds, because we know that every possibility has its own world, and the actual world is just one possibility among many. So how can we say that actualizing evils is bad? All it means to actualize an evil, all it means to do evil, is that the evil is over here in this world rather than over there in some other world. And why would that make a difference? So why should I care about saving this kid? If I save the child, well, I save that one, but then another one in some other world dies, so why should I care? A variant of this problem is to consider causing yourself pain. I'm cooking some dinner, I see the hot stove, and I could choose to put my hand on the stove and burn it. Just hold it there on the stove and burn right through. That will cause me a great deal of pain. Most people would probably describe that as pointless and stupid. But if I choose not to put my hand on the stove, I guarantee that one of my counterparts in another world will put his hand on the stove. So if I put my hand on the stove instead, I'm saving somebody from extreme pain. And that would usually be considered heroic. If you and your friend have been captured by enemy agents and your friend is selected for torture, but then you insist, no, take me, to prevent the pain from befalling another person, that would be a heroic act. So the objection is, if we're modal realists, that would have a pernicious effect on our moral judgments. We will end up having to say that it doesn't really matter if you let a child drown, and that it's heroic to stand by the cooker with your hand on the stove, just letting it burn. That's very bizarre moral judgments. So Lewis's response to this is to say that it assumes a sort of crude utilitarian ethics. Utilitarianism says that the right action is the action that maximizes pleasure and reduces suffering. Utilitarianism is famously completely impartial and universal. It doesn't matter where a person is, how far away from them you are. Your obligations to reduce their suffering hold just as strongly. Your moral obligations to the family member who lives with you in your house are essentially the same as your moral obligations to people in another continent. And this is what leads many utilitarians to argue that we should give enormous amounts of money, say 90% of our incomes, to charity. Peter Singer, for instance, argues that we should give very, very large amounts of money to charity. Let's say you go out and you're thinking of spending some money to buy your child a new toy. That same money could be sent to charity where it could literally save another child's life. Utilitarianism demands that you reduce suffering as much as possible, and since saving a life would reduce suffering far more than buying your kid a new toy, you are obligated, you have a moral obligation to give that money away. That's one of the sort of more extreme conclusions that utilitarianism arguably commits us to. So if you're a utilitarian, it does seem like you're obligated to reduce the suffering of people in other worlds, just as you're obligated to reduce the suffering of people in different continents. Lewis simply rejects utilitarianism. He says that we should be more concerned about the goods and evils that befall our close families and our communities than we should about the goods and evils that befall people lying on a different continent. And obviously we shouldn't really care much at all about goods and evils that occur in a completely different universe. That just shouldn't enter into our thinking at all. I mean, I tend to agree with Lewis here. I'm certainly not a utilitarian. I think people should care more about their families and friends than for strangers. You should give some people preferential treatment. The example I always like is, you see a bunch of people drowning. On the left are a load of famous cancer doctors, and on the right is your wife. You can throw a rope to the left and save the doctors. You can throw it to the right and save your wife. Utilitarianism would clearly demand that you save the doctors. There are more of them and they can do more good. But I would just say, I mean, obviously you should save your wife. It would be completely repugnant to save a bunch of strangers over a person you love. So utilitarianism is, I don't agree with it at all. So I say, I mean, I've found that attitudes differ very much when it comes to that example. But I agree with Lewis. We shouldn't be utilitarians, so it really doesn't matter that modal realism is a problem for utilitarians. I'd also add that, I mean, at the end of the day, whatever you think about utilitarianism, our ontology shouldn't be determined by our ethics, okay? So some people say that if we stop believing in God, that will have pernicious moral consequences. Even if you agree with that, I mean, that has no impact on what the facts are, right? On what the truth is. So even if we all accept, yeah, maybe we should encourage some people to believe in God because that will help maintain a sort of moral society, the fact is that that shouldn't have any effect on what we take the truth to be. I mean, because, you know, God's existence is not dependent on our ethics, on our morals. It gets it the wrong way round, right? So, I mean, I wouldn't say that that's really a very powerful objection, even if we do think it has pernicious moral consequences. That in itself wouldn't really be a reason to say that modal realism is factually incorrect. Okay, well, I might look at some more objections in a later video, but I think that's enough for today. Thanks for watching. I hope you found it interesting. Goodbye.